for good and for bad, right? Like I think the MPAA is probably a pretty good example where they say like they're giving parental guidance on it. And the Comics Code is a really bad example, right? They get a bunch of librarians and teachers to come up with this list of do's and don'ts.
It's a crazy list.
Yeah. Do you want to go over it?
Yes, badly. Like I read it to my wife last night and repeatedly she was like, what?
Yeah, totally. The first section of the Comics Code of 1954 is one called General Standards. There's a bunch of different sections. For General Standards, which is Part A. 1. Crime shall never be presented in such a way as to create sympathy for the criminal, to promote distrust of the forces of law and justice, or to inspire others with a desire to imitate criminals. Sorry, yes.
It's just like rule number 1, don't be a vigilante that is the hero of the story.
Yeah,
got it.
Basically. Yep.
Crap. No comics shall explicitly present the unique details and methods of a crime.
No instruction. This is a direct response to Wortham.
Now, this is an interesting one because like we talked about earlier, there is no like parameters on what that is.
100%. It's
Basically
totally
just like don't describe that crimes occur, period.
Yes. And like the way that this was enforced was subjective, by the way. Like they would hand the pages off to a person, like a librarian or a teacher or whatever. Like literally they would walk it down the street. The person would use whiteout and like red ink or whatever. They'd mark it up at what you had to change. And once they agreed on everything, they put the seal on it, right? And every page had to have the seal. So there was
that sounds like such a bureaucratic nightmare. It would take so long to create anything.
They end up being your colleagues, right? So I think eventually they had it down to a science, right?
Oh yeah, but I'm just thinking like early days, all of the red tape there, like, especially with the background of like you got to print an issue every week. You're working like 12-hour days with your skeleton crew, and it's like now we've added this like really big speed bump. Which that just sounds terrible. Oh, I should tell you one of my favorite jokes. Speed bumps are terribly named. If anything, they slow you down.
That is a really bad. That's a pretty bad dad joke. Policemen, judges, government officials, and respected institutions shall never be presented in such a way as to create disrespect for established authority. Right?
This is also a problem.
The man's the man. You got to respect him.
Yeah, never tell any story about corruption.
Yep.
If crime is depicted, it shall be as a sordid and unpleasant activity.
Criminals shall not be presented so as to be rendered glamorous or to occupy a position which creates a desire for emulation.
In every instance, good shall triumph over evil, and the criminal punished for his misdeeds.
Yes. Scenes of excessive violence shall be prohibited. Scenes of brutal torture, excessive and unnecessary knife and gunplay, physical agony, gory and gruesome crime shall all be eliminated.
So back to number 6.
Yeah.
In every instance, good shall triumph over evil. Now, this is kind of an interesting one because I can imagine being able to skate that one just a little bit by saying like, oh no, I'm telling an arc. It's a 5-story arc, and in the first 4, we're setting this guy up for his fall.
No,
right? But no, I doubt that would work.
It's got to be on a per issue basis.
Every issue, crazy.
No unique or unusual methods of concealing weapons shall be shown.
Well, Batman's got a problem with his utility belt.
Yeah, I guess so. I guess it depends on what a weapon is.
Yeah. Instances of law enforcement officers dying as a result of a criminal's activities should be discouraged.
Yeah,
not a rule.
No,
more of a guideline.
Yeah, yes. A lot of these are kind of squishy. The crime of kidnapping shall never be portrayed in any detail, nor shall any profit accrue to the abductor or kidnapper. The criminal or the kidnapper must be punished in every case. I think it's really interesting to me is like you can't show someone kidnapped. Also, when the kidnapping happens, it's like, wait, what? I thought you said you could. Maybe they're saying like if it happens off panel, like you still,
It's like, okay, so we have this rule, but when you break this rule, don't break this second rule.
Yes,
because the second rule is the real rule. The first rule is a decoy.
Yes,
the letters of the word crime on a comics magazine shall never be appreciably greater in dimension than the other words contained in the title. The word crime shall never appear alone on a cover.
Yes, which we'll see here in a bit. Very common. at the time.
Oh, interesting.
Crime comics were actually a thing. Were them railing against crime comics should not have included like Wonder Woman and Daffy Duck or whatever, but like crime comics were a big deal. Yeah.
I mean, true crime is still huge. Like people are still talking.
Yeah.
I mean, people are fascinated by the rule breakers.
Yeah. Restraint in the use of the word crime in titles or subtitles shall be exercised, right? So this is basically saying like crime can't be the only thing on your title, on your book cover, and it can't be the title, right? If you're using it, it's incidental, right?
These are the ones that were some of the most interesting ones to me of like, we're like blocking a specific word. Mm-hmm. This is kind of strange. And it's not a curse word. It's just crime.
I think this is a direct response to the proliferation of books that did exactly this. We're going to look at covers. I have slides here in a minute of like the only thing on the cover. It's a crime. It does not pay. You know, like it was a genre.
Man. That's so funny. It's like that O.J. Simpson book that said I did it in huge letters, but it says if very small. If I did it. That's 100%. Really
okay. General Standards Part B.
No comic magazine shall use the word horror or terror in its title. Oh yeah, these are crazy. Yeah. These are wild.
So there's another genre of comic book that we didn't really talk about and weren't talked about too much in Wortham's book, which were horror comic books that were becoming incredibly popular at this time.
Which is like Frankenstein, the Mummy, the Wolfman.
Yes, and this is saying basically this whole section is like those can't exist.
No.
All scenes of horror, excessive bloodshed, gory or gruesome crimes, depravity, lust, sadism, masochism shall not be permitted.
All lurid, unsavory, gruesome illustrations shall be eliminated.
Inclusions of stories dealing with evil shall be used or shall be published only where the intent is to illustrate a moral issue, and in no case shall ever be presented alluringly, nor so as to injure the sensibilities of the reader.
Ooh, can't injure those sensibilities. Scenes dealing with or instruments associated with Walking Dead, torture, vampires and vampirism, ghouls, cannibalism, and werewolfism are prohibited. Now, I'm a true nerd, and I know it's not werewolfism, it's lycanthropy.
Yeah. None of that.
No, not allowed.
Can't do it. That's
Which is wild, because those seem like the ones that are like among the safest. It's not true crime. It's like totally fictional fantasy.
Yeah.
Badness.
But if you're like a church group, right? Like the Catholic Church, as an example, was part of the crusade against comic books, right? And it's like Satanism, right? It's like occultism, right? It's false idols.
But also
yes.
So it's Easter Sunday in the Christian faith. We've got The Walking Dead.
Yeah, he raises from the dead. That's true.
Yeah. But we already know, established, those are crime comics anyway.
Yes. Because everything's a crime comic.
Yeah.
General Standards Part C.
Profanity, obscenity, smut, vulgarity, or words or symbols which have acquired undesirable meanings are forbidden.
No cursing. Special precautions to avoid references to physical afflictions or deformity shall be taken.
So the no cursing one is also interesting because they said no words or symbols which have acquired. So it's not even like no cursing, sure, but not even references to cursing. Like you can't do like the exclamation.
No, that's right.
Like blah, blah, blah. That looks like a curse. That's also interesting. Also, who decides what is a symbol that has undesirable meanings? Because like I think generally in the 50s they could agree on like the swastika is not good.
Sure.
But there are other symbols that there's at some point like they changed over history and became bad, and it's difficult to draw lines.
Yeah, they're going to decide. Like it is subjective, totally. Yeah. What's really telling as well is that those things are lumped in with physical afflictions or deformities, right? So nobody with hunchback, nobody with a cleft palate, nobody that's missing a leg, nobody in a wheelchair. Nobody.
Right. That's also interesting to me because
no disabilities.
Physical afflictions. Is like, how do you draw the line on that? Is it just like everyone has to be healthy? And
basically,
that's crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is crazy. And that it's in this bucket.
Because I can see it being in the same bucket as like werewolfism and like you can't, because like zombies and stuff like that, like, they've got physical afflictions. But it's like totally different to say like you can't have a person with a cane.
Shouldn't see it. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's not okay.
Wow. And this is especially coming straight off of World War II and that whole Aryan race thing.
Yeah. 100%. Yeah. Not great. Not great.
Although slang and colloquialisms are acceptable, excessive use should be discouraged, and wherever possible, good grammar shall be employed. Mm-hmm. So no pirates.
That's right. General Standards Part C.
Ridicule or attack on any religious or racial group is never permissible.
Yep.
Which is also interesting because it seems like a time in history not that different from today where non-Christians are always vilified.
Sure. This is a whole section.
Oh, yeah. There was one that had just one rule.
Religion. Yeah, it's a whole section. It is the only rule.
Religion. Anything goes.
Yeah, basically. Then comes the next section, costume. Nudity in any form is prohibited as an indecent or undue exposure. As is an indecent or undue exposure.
Suggestive and salacious illustration or suggestive posture is unacceptable. This is what they got Batman on.
Robin standing with his wide stance.
Oh, man.
All characters shall be depicted and dressed reasonably acceptable to society. That's vague.
Yeah, super vague. Females shall be drawn realistically without exaggeration of any physical qualities. Note, it should be recognized that all prohibitions dealing with costume, dialogue, or artwork applies as specifically to the cover of a comic magazine as they do to the contents.
Yeah.
Fair note.
Yeah. There are scholars, including Tilly, that point out that this basically discouraged women from being on covers at all, and discouraged the inclusion of women in stories overall. And so you actually see a significant decline in women appearing in comic books. And as a result of a lot of this, we'll get into some of the results, a significant drop in women readership as well, right? It used to be cutting across race, gender, etc. That is not the case after the Comics Code.
This is not good. But I also am thinking like I would try and break these rules and get away with it. Like I would try like really buff women.
Sure.
Yeah.
That probably would not fly, but section on marriage and sex.
Divorce shall not be treated humorously nor represented as desirable.
Illicit sex relations are neither to be hinted at nor portrayed. Violent love scenes as well as sexual abnormalities are unacceptable.
Respect for parents, the moral code, and for honorable behavior shall be fostered. A sympathetic understanding of the problems of love is not a license for morbid distortion.
Yeah, interesting one.
That's a really interesting one.
Yeah. The treatment of live romance stories shall emphasize the value of home and the sanctity of marriage. They're not hooking up, okay?
Yeah, no escapism allowed here. Passion or romantic interest shall never be treated in such a way as to stimulate the lower and baser emotions.
Lower emotions. That's such an interesting character.
Yeah.
No one would ever say that today.
No.
Seduction and rape shall never be shown or suggested. Seduction and rape. Composite, like those together.
Yeah.
As sort of like equivalent.
I remember when I read that, I was confused. I was like, did seduction mean something different then than it does now? Or is it anything related to like...
I think maybe considered more lurid in that like it's convincing you to be impure, right? Like that sex is something that you should not do, and so they're convincing you to do a bad thing.
Those baser emotions.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sex perversion or any inference to same is strictly forbidden. So they're talking about homosexuality here, right?
Yeah. I didn't realize that when I read it yesterday.
Yep. I thought I needed to point that out because if you're not, that's what they're talking about.
Yeah.
And then finally, this one is really fascinating to me.
Yes.
Code for advertising matter.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay. So there's still another one. I had to look up a word when I was reading these. So we're still getting there. Liquor and tobacco advertising is not acceptable.
Advertisements of sex or sex instruction books are unacceptable.
The sale of picture postcards, pinups, art studies, or any other reproduction of nude or semi-nude figures is prohibited. This one's also interesting to me because they're just coming out of World War II where pinups were everywhere. Like I I don't know if they existed before World War II, but like when people talk about pinups, my mind goes to World War II.
Well, by the way, this doesn't apply to like everything on the newsstand. This is for comic books.
Oh yeah, it's just it's just interesting.
Like Playboy, it's still a thing, right? Like you know, the other magazines, still a thing. They are allowed to do whatever they want. This is only for the comic book publishers. Like I think only 6 or 7 publishers signed on to this, right?
Yeah. So. But this also, I mean, I guess based on the statistics you were showing before, this is for children. Period. Like comic books equals children.
That is an important thing that happened here, right? Like before, comic books could be targeted at adults. In fact, they were, because like comic books were incredibly popular with GIs. Like the armed services that went away for World War II read comic books. They sent them overseas. We know it. Like we bought them and we sent them to GIs. And they came home, they could continue reading comic books. So adults were reading them. But basically, with the advent of the comics code, no longer, right? That is no longer the case. Yeah. Comic books are for kids.
You think those GIs were getting the comic books for the pinups?
I have no idea. I don't think so. I suspect that was not very frequent. I was not common.
Agree. I'm just making a joke. Advertising for the sale of knives or realistic gun facsimiles is prohibited. So the gun facsimiles is interesting too, because that's back to the zip gun thing.
Potentially, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Advertising for the sale of fireworks is prohibited.
Which, were fireworks illegal at that time?
I have no idea.
Because like
I'd have to look that up.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting that it's like waned and waxed.
When did fireworks become illegal? I think that's probably actually a state-by-state thing.
I know it is now.
Massachusetts, 1943.
Is that when they legalized or illegalized?
Illegal.
Oh, I see. So presumed legal then, and then made illegal.
Oh wow, some states don't. It's just legal. Apparently, you can do fireworks year-round in Iowa.
Yeah. Now, when I was a kid, it was illegal all the time, even on the 4th of July. I grew up in Iowa, for the audience. But yeah, now it's legal, which is crazy. When I visit for the 4th of July and I hear fireworks going off, it's like, this isn't allowed.
Yeah, fascinating. The Wikipedia page is complicated. It's state by state, very much so.
It's pretty complicated, yeah. It's just that this one is kind of interesting to me because it
might have been the case that like people were harvesting gunpowder for use in zip guns. I don't know. Or
it's a good thought.
Using it in hooliganism or
fireworks for children are just dangerous in general. So only used with parental oversight or whatever. Advertising dealing with the sale of gambling equipment or printed matter dealing with gambling shall not be accepted. Nudity with meretricious purpose and salacious postures shall not be permitted in the advertising of any product. Clothed figures shall never be presented in such a way as to be offensive or contrary to good taste or morals.
Okay, $5 word, Brian. Tell us, what is meretricious?
Meretricious. Okay, my understanding is it's basically without any substance. So nudity for no purpose, nudity for to be sexual, which I think is separating nudity in terms of like the art form, and that sometimes it is acceptable, but it's not sexual. This is the other type of nudity.
Fascinating. Okay. Yeah. To the best of the ability, each publisher shall ascertain that all statements made in advertisements conform to fact and avoid misrepresentation.
Advertisements of medical, health, or toiletry products of questionable nature are to be rejected. Advertisements for medical, health, or toiletry products endorsed by the American Medical Association or the American Dental Association shall be deemed acceptable if they conform with all other conditions of the advertising code.
Yeah, and so there we go. That is the end of the Comics Code. What do you think? Do you have any thoughts on the code?
It's crazy. It's like layers and layers of crazy.
Yeah.
Just because it's not very specific. It is more about like I'm laying out all these things so that you can write things in the spirit of what we want. Yeah. Not like literally what we want, because the way we've written it, when we don't know what we literally want.
100%. Yeah.
And it's like it's totally impossible to draw any lines here, and it's all gray, and it's like extremely subjective, which like I can get behind the idea that like art is subjective.
Totally.
And like I watched it's a really good documentary about the MPAA called This Film Not Yet Rated. It's really interesting.
Yeah.
And it made this argument that like comparing one piece of art to another piece of art, one that's accepted does not necessarily mean the other one's accepted because they're similar, because they're very subjective. And like I can get behind that type of thinking,
totally,
of it being really subjective, but it's also so restrictive as to not be able to tell any story of value also.
I don't know if that's entirely true, but it definitely eliminates whole categories of valuable stories.
That's
right?
fair. That's a better description.
And that's what happened, right? So like horror comic books, not a thing. There's a very famous publisher at the time called EC Comics, run by a guy named Maxwell Gaines, would go on to start EC Comics that did did horror comic books that are very, very popular in reprints now. People love them because they do all kinds of cool, eerie, creepy, they had a book called Eerie. They had a book called Creepy, and they did zombies and werewolves and vampires and they stopped, right? That company basically gave up on comics and went on to create something that you might have heard of called Mad Magazine.
No way. Okay, yeah.
Because they didn't have to conform to the comics code by doing a magazine instead of a comic book.
Oh, that's so smart.
Yes. And so that's where that comes from. Crime Does Not Pay, which is one that Wortham was particularly upset about. And we're going to look at a bunch of pictures of it here in just a moment. I made you read one of those. They just gave up. They folded. There's whole classes of people who were writing comic books that were targeted at adults that were completely incompatible. And they just gave up. They just stopped. One of the reasons that superhero comics persist is because they were one of the most compatible sets of comic books on the shelves, right? Romance comic books stop. What they called quote unquote jungle comic books stopped. Western comic books.
What's
stopped.
a jungle comic book?
Tarzan, basically. Right?
Oh, okay.
There's this idea of like, I forget what it's called, like exoticism, or like the idea that like it's racist,
Yeah, well, that's why I was asking, because I know that like, jungle is like a pretty racist term at that time.
Yes. The idea that there's, I will say it's like vaguely racist. Like to say that like there's no redeeming qualities at all in anything in the genre is probably not true, but like the high level conception is like probably pretty racist. But the idea that there are places on Earth that are like untouched by quote unquote civilization that can be explored, right? And so there's a fascination and intrigue with like the other, the different, the new, that I think is a little naive and childlike, and is not offensive in that way, but is offensive in the idea that like, Africa doesn't count as civilization, right?
Yeah.
That was a category that completely went away. Westerns completely went away, right? But basically, one of the reasons that superhero comics persist is because they didn't need to change much, right? So the premise of the episode is like, how did Batman change? It's like, well, he stopped being a vigilante. Like he started being a duly deputized officer of the law.
Robin put some pants on.
He didn't. No, he basically stayed the same. And a lot of the things that they were doing stayed the same, but instead they were working with the police instead of being sort of like skirting around it. And in some ways they capitulated to this sort of thing already because they knew that because they were targeting kids, right? Yeah. Because Batman didn't use guns because that was their target market. And so the Comics Code coming in and saying like, hey, you have to continue to sell to your target market. They didn't have to pivot that much. It is true that there was a significant increase in fantastical stories, like more fantasy and more science fiction, and less like organized crime, because organized crime stories became a little bit harder to tell. Right? They lean more into the Riddler and Joker and Mr. Freeze, etc. Because if you have a mobster, that's hard to fit into the code.
It's
right?
Actual crime. Yeah, it's exactly. Like real world crime stuck in this fictional world versus fictional goofy crime. Totally. But also like the way that like Joker shows up is different because it's like a more of like a jester than it is like a bad guy dressed like a clown. Totally.
But it's a small pivot, right? Like the Joker already was a guy that dressed up as a clown.
Yeah.
Right. And they were doing stuff like that all through the 40s. So yeah, it is a change. But it's a smaller one, and that's why they persist.
It's also kind of fascinating to me that at the time that there weren't any companies that were like, okay, we have this Comics Code Authority. That's great. They can put the parental advisory sticker on or approved by whatever. This is safe for kids or whatever, and then still keep publishing stuff that was like, well, this is really for adults. And so we don't need the Comics Code Authority, but since it's lacking that sticker, don't let your kids read it. Like it is kind of interesting that nobody seemed to really be like, okay, this is an advisory group to add a rating system, and we'll just keep shipping our adult stuff, you know.
I think Mad Magazine is the example of someone trying to do that, where they pivoted and it was a magazine that had some comics in it, as opposed to being a comic book. It is the case that distributors and newsstands, by and large, roundly decided that they would not carry comic books that were not certified by the Comics Code. Yeah. So it was the case that, like, if you were publishing something that was a quote unquote comic book, that you had to be approved by the Comics Code Authority. So, you know, there really wasn't an underground. I think that would have been a far healthier outcome, right? Like, we're going to look at a bunch of pictures of stuff that happens in Crime Does Not Pay here in a second. And it is the case that I don't want my 4-year-old to see those things.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
For sure. It's terrible.
And so, right. And so if I were to take my kid into a gas station and some of the covers that we're going to see here in a second were next to Batman, that might be upsetting to me, maybe, you know, because he's going to look at it and maybe grab it, and I'm going to have to explain that to him, and that's going to be hard. I'm not saying that, like, we have to shelter our children, like, to such a degree that we don't have those conversations, because, yeah, you have to tell your 4-year-old, like, hey, this is violence, right?
Like, in the real world. Yeah.
100%.
Yeah.
But, like, I'm sympathetic to it, right? The idea that, like, you want to be able to control access. And so I do think it's a shame that at that time, they weren't able to come up with a smarter way to do it, right?
Yeah.
Because now, yeah, you do get the PG-G, PG-13R, just because we, you know, want to protect children doesn't preclude the existence of things that are for adults.
Right.
And that the attitude was not the same at the time, and they didn't succeed in doing that, right? They didn't preserve the sort of broad appeal where 95% of kids were reading it. Like, a significant portion less did. And the ones that were left were, like, you know, white boys from like 13 to 18, right?
Yeah.
And like that's a shame, right? Because now there's this cultural touchstone that everyone's not participating in. And if you look at, like, manga in Japan, they're much closer to that. Like, they have manga books that are about, like, boxing and about playing the violin and about, you know, volleyball and about yes, like, male power fantasy. They call them shonen, right? Which is like young boys, like Dragon Ball Z, right? Or like Naruto or whatever. But they also have, like, love comic books, right? Like, where girls, there's the ones that are called slice of life, where you just, like, see about what it's like to be a kid, right? And, like, it's almost like the Calvin and Hobbes, right? Like, they have far more variety for lots of different people, and we lost that with comic books, and in some ways have struggled to reclaim it, and that really haven't reclaimed it. And that's a shame. Like, I think that is a true shame. So one does long for a world where there was more room for variety.
Yeah. It's I mean, your Calvin and Hobbes example is really interesting, because it's like, would that have passed Comics Code Authority?
Probably not. Yeah.
Yeah.
Not the 1954 version. Yeah.
Yeah. It's just kind of interesting, because that is, like, one of the more fascinating, like, philosophical, educational.
Yeah.
Like, it's named after two philosophers, right?
It's about innocence. It's about kids living their lives and like,
and making you think.
Yeah. Shame there's not more of that in comic books. So here's some of the things that did appear in Crime Does Not Pay. These are, like, if to put yourselves in the shoes of a parent to understand, like, why you might get, like, whipped up into fervor of it. There is like some pretty serious stuff. Here's a cover of one of the issues of Crime Does Not Pay. Yeah. Crime, gigantic letters, right? Clearly the most important part of it is, like, where advertising is crime and does not pay in small text.
Yeah.
The man, like,
and it's like a horrible cover too.
Awful violence for sure.
Awful violence. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
They had this character that didn't appear in every story in Crime Does Not Pay, but it was this sort of personification of crime. And the idea was that he was like the devil sitting on your shoulder, and he was sort of like talking you into things and, like, saying, you know, once you get a taste, you're gonna do more. It's like, you know, yes, this is gonna be a good evil person for me. You know, he was the narrator.
Yeah,
appeared frequently.
This is also an interesting depiction of this guy. Like, is his head in his hands, or is he, like, saying quiet voices in my head? No.
I don't know. That's a good point. Huh. Here's a title page for a book. This is pretty
brutal.
Pretty serious stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
And like, you know, it's really funny to me. Oftentimes the worst stuff was on the title page because they couldn't put it on the cover, but it actually doesn't appear in the story.
Oh, jeez.
So like this scene where like the dude's got the bullet between his eyes and blood spewing everywhere, that doesn't appear in the book, right? Like it's incredibly violent. I mean, he shoots people and stuff, but like you don't see that. Like the most graphic depiction is on the title page, right? The one I had you read, you said is about H.H. Holmes.
Yeah.
You actually knew the story.
Oh, I worked it out very quickly because I know the story of H.H. Holmes. I'm a big true crime buff, so there's a whole bunch of stuff like this that I just know.
I chose this one for you to read because I thought it was the best example of like, a fair bit of violence, but also sort of sexualization of the female figure.
Seduction.
Right. And one of the examples where, I don't know, it just felt like a good example of the type of things that people were worried about. That like whips people into sort of the fervor.
Absolutely. Yeah. There's some stuff in here that just like thinking about is awful.
Yeah.
There's a point in this story where this is to get this guy's money. He takes him out and he kills him. And that's like bad. But he also goes back and he kills his 3 children.
Yes. Yeah.
Because that was like collateral damage for the crime that he was committing because he needed the money. And they never, according to the story, they never found the kids. And and there's this point where the mother is like, I know what you did and I'm going to get you for this. But also like, I cannot imagine the life of that woman now. 3 kids and husband, all murdered. Yeah. No peace. Horrible. Just horrible to wrap your mind around. It's that it's a little veiled. I mean, it's not like veiled, but it's not, if you go back to that last one. Yeah. It's that yellow panel in the center where it's just a trunk with blood coming out of it and there's 3 kids in there. Yeah.
It's kind of messed up.
Yeah.
There's a lot of depictions of him killing people in various ways, shooting them, strangling them.
Yeah. All because he needs financial gains. It's like, I'll set you up with a life insurance policy and then we'll pretend like you die and then I get money and it's great. And then he like literally kills him.
Yeah. Or he's like selling their skeletons at one point too, right? Is that a thing?
Oh yeah. That's part of why he was doing it is like, one, he's a depraved lunatic who likes killing people, but he early in the book, it's he sells the woman's body, which I think is probably related. It's when he first meets that doctor right there in the top right. Yeah. It's the total stranger needed to kill her because great specimen for these doctors to kind of tear into and learn about science, essentially. Like there was a point in history where we couldn't get cadavers. And that's where grave robbing came from. And there was a point within grave robbing where they realized that they could produce bodies instead of digging them up, and that's way faster. And that's what some of this is.
So yeah, I think this is just an example of like, at the end he gets hung.
He gets hung, and it's like graphic, like his
pretty graphic.
Tongue's hanging out of his mouth.
So like, I think I just bring this up to like show some sympathy for like a concern. Like if your 10-year-old showed up from school, with this in his backpack, like you'd be kind of pissed. I feel like, right?
Oh
like,
yeah.
And Lord knows, right? Like our version would be amped up in terms of the graphicness.
Yeah, the art would be a lot better.
Yeah, this was pretty out there for them at the time. It's just to say that it's a complicated subject. That being said, like I don't see any reason why this shouldn't exist for an adult reader, you know, or like frankly like a 17-year-old or whatever. I think with the maturity to like be able to understand and process the content like comes the ability to like enjoy it as well for what it is. But yeah, any other thoughts on Crime Does Not Pay?
Yeah, it's a terrible comic. I am still kind of like surprised that you haven't heard of H.H. Holmes, but I think it's because I'm so deep in
you're a true crime guy. Yeah, I'm not.
Oh yeah, there's hundreds of hours of podcasts.
Yeah, no, I listened to Serial
like that
once. That's about it for me.
Oh yeah. No, but yeah. So H.H. Holmes was when we read Gotham by Gaslight.
Yeah.
I thought it was going to be about H.H. Holmes.
Oh, fascinating. Okay.
But it was actually...
wasn't he in America? H.H. Holmes was in America.
He was in Chicago, I think. It was The Devil in the White City. So I
only know because of the comic.
Oh, yeah. So there was this point where they were doing a World's Fair there, and he built this big, complicated like hotel.
right,
of a sort, you know, except he had all these trapdoors and people would just go missing, and
That's wild.
And it was because so many people traveled into town, there was no way to communicate. It was very easy for people to go missing and not know why or how or whatever.
Crazy.
And they wouldn't notice they were missing for weeks when they didn't come home and stuff like that.
I mean, they did a poor job of settling that story then, because that's actually some crazy like intrigue, like horror stuff.
Yeah, it's crazy.
The way they told the comic book is like he killed a bunch of people.
Yeah, he's a bad person who killed people, and it was all about the money.
Yeah, and then he got hung. The end.
Yeah,
that's everything I had prepared about the Comics Code. I will say we're going to talk about it again. There's no way we can't. It pervades the comic book culture for some time to come. I've read multiple books on this. There's one called The 10-Cent Plague. There's another called Seal of Approval. It cannot be encapsulated in one episode of Bat Lessons, so we'll come back. But yeah, any closing thoughts?
I can't wait until we read some of those Silver Age comics, and we can make reference to like how notably different like the atmosphere is in those compared to
how it fits in the code.
And compared to Golden Age.
100%.
Yeah, I'm really glad we got this one in the can. It's been really interesting. I hope it was interesting for everyone in the audience too.
100%. Yeah.
Hey, Bat fam. Hope you like the show. Please like and subscribe. It helps us out a lot. Stickers. We got them. Great way to support the show. They're $5, and you can find a link in the description and on batlessons.com. To keep on rolling, watch this video.